Dylan brought the harmonica to his lips, closed his eyes, and then he didn't play, he just stepped back, and everyone in the room understood that something had changed forever. Minneapolis. February 1978. The Orpheum Theater. 412 people in worn velvet seats. The stage lights were warm amber, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Bob Dylan stood at the microphone in a dark jacket and white shirt, his hair wild and graying, his face carrying the weight of 17 years since he'd become the voice of a generation he never asked to represent. The crowd had been waiting for this moment. The encore. The song everyone wanted. The song they always wanted. Dylan reached for his harmonica. Lifted it slowly. His fingers were steady, but his eyes, when they closed, carried something the audience couldn't name. Exhaustion, maybe? Or resignation? Or something deeper that didn't have a word. The room held its breath. And then Dylan stepped back from the microphone. Not dramatically. Not with explanation. Just one step. Then another. The harmonica lowered to his side. His eyes opened but didn't focus on anyone. He looked past the lights, past the crowd, past everything. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. No one moved. No one coughed. 412 people suspended in the space between what they expected and what was happening. Dylan turned and walked off stage. Left. Into the darkness of the wings. The house lights didn't come up. The band didn't move. The audience didn't applaud. They just sat there, confused and somehow changed, without understanding why. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what happened 6 hours earlier. Dylan had arrived at the Orpheum at 4 in the afternoon for soundcheck. Not unusual. He was always early, always particular about the acoustics, about the way his voice sat in a room. But today he'd come alone. No band members yet. No road crew setting up. Just Dylan and an empty theater and the ghost of 1,000 performances that felt increasingly like someone else's life. He'd walked onto the dark stage. Stood at the microphone. Looked out at the empty seats. Row after row of burgundy velvet disappearing into shadow. There was a man sitting in the front row. Dylan stopped. "We're not open yet." "I know." The man didn't move. He was maybe 60, wearing a worn coat, his hands folded in his lap. "I'm the building manager. I've been here 32 years. Dylan nodded slowly, unsure what response was expected. "I saw you play here in '63. The man continued. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic for existing. "You were 22 years old. Played solo. Just you and a guitar and a harmonica. 14 songs. 67 people in the audience." Dylan didn't remember. He'd played 1,000 venues in 1963. Small theaters, coffee houses, folk clubs. They all blurred together into a haze of cigarette smoke and borrowed guitars and the naive certainty that songs could change the world. "You played a song that night that I'd never heard before or since," the man said. Something about a letter that never got sent. About waiting for someone who was already gone. Dylan's jaw tightened. He knew the song. He'd written it when he was 19 about a girl whose name he could barely remember now. He performed it maybe 15 times total before deciding it was too raw, too personal, too much like opening a vein on stage. "That song," the man said, his voice catching slightly. "My daughter had just died. 6 days before your concert. Car accident. She was 17. I came to your show because I didn't know where else to go. Didn't know how to sit in my house with her empty room down the hall. The theater was very quiet. Just the two of them and 32 years of distance collapsing into this single moment. You played that song and I understood that someone else knew. That grief wasn't something to fix. Just something to carry. And for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, I wasn't carrying it alone." Dylan stood very still at the microphone, his hands in his pockets. "I never forgot that," the man continued. Spent 32 years hoping you'd come back and play it again. Silly, I know. It's just a song. You probably don't even remember writing it. I remember, Dylan said quietly. The man smiled sadly. I didn't come here to ask you to play it tonight. I know you've got bigger songs now. More important songs. I just wanted to say thank you for being in a theater in 1963 when an old man needed someone to understand. He stood up, buttoned his coat, started walking toward the exit. What was her name? Dylan asked. The man stopped, turned. Caroline. Dylan watched him leave, listened to the theater door close with a soft pneumatic hiss, stood alone on stage in the amber work lights and felt the weight of 17 years pressed down on his shoulders. He'd spent those years becoming Bob Dylan, the icon, the voice, the legend. He'd written anthems and won awards and watched his songs become bigger than himself. He'd played for presidents and protesters and 50,000 people who sang his words back to him without knowing what they meant. But tonight, for the first time in years, he remembered being 22 years old and writing a song about grief because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling. He walked to the edge of the stage, sat down, legs dangling over the orchestra pit, pulled his harmonica from his pocket, played 3 notes of that old song, the one about the letter, about waiting, about Caroline who never got to hear it. The notes echoed in the empty theater, and Dylan thought about all the songs he'd written that became movements, that became symbols, that belonged to everyone except him. And he thought about the one song that had belonged to a grieving father for 32 years. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The concert that night was sold out. Dylan performed his set, the hits everyone expected, the newer material they tolerated, the encores they demanded. He was professional, competent, present in body if not entirely in spirit. But when he walked back out for the final encore, something had shifted. The crowd wanted "Blowin' in the Wind," or "The Times They Are A-Changin'," or one of the other songs that had become public property. Songs that didn't belong to him anymore. Songs that carried the weight of generations and movements and meanings he'd never intended. Dylan picked up his harmonica. The crowd cheered, anticipating which anthem he'd chosen. He brought it to his lips, closed his eyes, and remembered a man sitting alone in row 3 of an empty theater, carrying his daughter's name like a stone in his pocket for 32 years. Dylan opened his eyes, looked out at 412 people who wanted Bob Dylan the icon to give them Bob Dylan the anthem. And he stepped back from the microphone. Because he understood suddenly, completely, that he couldn't give them what they wanted. Not tonight. Not this song. This belonged to someone else. To a man named Caroline's father who had sat in the same theater 15 years before Dylan became the voice of anything. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. Backstage, the venue manager found Dylan sitting on a folding chair in the dim hallway, his harmonica still in his hand. "Everything okay?" The crowd's confused. "Should I make an announcement?" "No." Dylan's voice was quiet. "Let them be confused. But sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop. Just stop. Not every moment needs to be filled with sound." The manager didn't understand but nodded anyway. Left Dylan alone in the hallway with the muffled sound of 412 people slowly beginning to file out, talking in hushed tones about the strange ending to the concert. Dylan sat there for 20 minutes after the theater emptied. Then he stood up, walked back onto the dark stage, and placed his harmonica on the piano bench. Left it there like an offering, or an apology, or acknowledgement that some songs were too sacred to perform. The building manager, the man whose daughter was named Caroline, found it the next morning during his walk-through. Recognized it immediately as Dylan's. Called the tour manager, who said he'd send someone to pick it up. "No need," the man said. "I'll keep it safe." He placed it in a small wooden box in his office, next to a ticket stub from 1963. next to a photograph of a 17-year-old girl who never got to hear the song written about letters that never get sent. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. That night in Minneapolis became a strange footnote in Dylan's history. The concert where he didn't finish. Where he walked off stage without explanation. Music critics wrote confused reviews. Fans debated what it meant. Some said he was making a statement. Others said he was just tired. Difficult. Aging ungracefully into irrelevance. But the people who were there, the 412 who sat in those velvet seats, they understood something the critics didn't. They'd witnessed the exact moment when Bob Dylan chose silence over performance. When he chose one man's grief over 400 people's expectations. They'd seen him remember that before he was an icon, he was just someone writing songs in dark rooms, hoping someone would understand. Years later, in interviews, Dylan would occasionally be asked about that night. About why he stopped. About what the song was supposed to be. He never answered directly. Just said, "Some songs aren't meant to be performed. They're meant to exist. To be remembered by the one person who needs them." In 1995, the building manager died. He was 79. At his funeral, his son found the wooden box in his father's office. The ticket stub. The photograph. The harmonica. There was a note tucked underneath, written in shaky handwriting. "This belonged to the man who understood. Keep it safe. Some gifts are too important to return." The son donated it to a small folk music museum in Minneapolis. It sits in a glass case now. A harmonica that was never played. Next to a story that was never finished. But that's not where this story ends. In 2003, 25 years after that night at the Orpheum, a young woman named Caroline walked into that museum. She was named after her grandmother, the 17-year-old who died in 1963, 40 years before this Caroline was born. Her father had told her the story. About the grandfather who went to a Bob Dylan concert 6 days after losing his daughter. About the song that helped him breathe again. About the harmonica left on a piano bench. She stood in front of the glass case for 17 minutes. Read the placard. Read her grandmother's name. Read about the concert where Dylan stopped. Then she did something the museum curator had never seen before. She sat down on the floor in front of the case, pulled out her phone, and searched for Bob Dylan's touring schedule. He was playing in Chicago in 2 weeks. 73 years old now. Still touring. Still carrying songs across dark highways. She bought a ticket. Front row. When Dylan walked onto that Chicago stage, older, more weathered, moving slower but still moving, she held up a sign. Just 3 words, written in marker on cardboard. "Thank you, Caroline." Dylan stopped mid-song. Squinted past the lights. Stared at those 3 words for a long moment that felt like it contained 40 years. He didn't explain. He didn't acknowledge it verbally. He just nodded once, barely perceptible to anyone else in the arena. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a harmonica, not the one from 1978, but one that looked identical, and played 4 notes. The opening of that song about letters never sent. About waiting for someone already gone. Just 4 notes. Incomplete. Unfinished. Then he put the harmonica away and continued the concert as if nothing had happened. But Caroline understood. And somewhere, a building manager who'd been gone for 8 years understood too. And 412 people who'd sat in an Orpheum theater in 1978 and watched Bob Dylan step away from a microphone, they understood. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The real power wasn't in the songs Dylan played. It was in the ones he didn't. In the space he left for grief to exist without needing to be fixed or performed or turned into anthem. In the moment when he chose one man's memory over a crowd's expectation. In the harmonica left on a piano bench like a promise that some things are too sacred to finish. Bob Dylan taught the world that protest songs could change minds. But that night in Minneapolis, he taught something quieter, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is knowing when to stop. The glass case in the museum still holds the harmonica. Visitors walk past it every day, most without stopping. It's not glamorous. There's no video of the moment. No recording of the song that wasn't played. Just a small metal instrument, and a story about a man who understood that being heard isn't the same as being understood. And sometimes silence says more than any lyric ever could.